The quarterly compliance assessment ran on the third Thursday of every fourth month, which meant I had sat through 2 of them before this one, and expected to sit through a dozen more before my posting rotated. It was not a test you studied for. The Sovereign Curricular Grid had one function: confirm that every cadet in the Drenith intake cohort spoke, read, and thought in approved Drenith standard. Nothing older, nothing regional, nothing outside the published lexicon's current edition. Pass was the only result it was designed to return. The grid had returned it 843 consecutive times without variation, going back 11 years. I had been at the academy for 6 months. I knew what the test was for. I had no particular opinion about it. The assessment chamber held 22 cadets in individual sealed booths, opaque polymer walls that went floor to ceiling, a single interface panel per station. Assessor Prell ran the room from the elevated observation ring, Keth Sorvani, ridge crests running their usual pale silver, the color they held when a thing was bureaucratic and expected to stay that way. The grid's intake chime sounded, the booths sealed, the interface panels lit. Standard protocol. The grid would read a passage in Drenith Standard, then prompt the cadet to respond in kind. Vocabulary outside the approved lexicon triggered a flag. 3 flags triggered remedial reclassification. The session lasted 40 minutes. I read the first prompt. Responded. The grid accepted it. The second prompt arrived. A passage about atmospheric navigation, technical vocabulary, the kind of language the lexicon had standardized 30 years ago when the Consolidation Committee rewrote the Academy's linguistic baseline. I answered in Drenith Standard. The third prompt was a passage about colony station infrastructure, pressurization systems, hull integrity management. I answered in Drenith Standard. And then, without thinking about it at all, I used the old word for the fiber and polymer composite that lined most pre-consolidation station hulls, not the approved term. The one from the manuals we had growing up, the ones printed into the insulation panels themselves, recycled text fiber from some archive that got compressed into wall material sometime before I was born. You read what was in front of you on a cold station. The walls had words on them. I had read them. The grid flagged it. I looked at the flag. Then I looked at the interface and answered the next prompt, and I used the word again because it was the correct word for the thing. The grid flagged it a second time. In the observation ring, Assessor Prell's ridge crests shifted, silver going amber at the edges, the color for administrative anomaly. 2 flags in 4 minutes was outside the distribution. The grid moved to the next section, biological cataloging. The passage used the lexicon's current term for a class of soil microorganisms. I knew the current term. I also knew the pre-consolidation term, and the regional variant used on stations in the outer belt, and the archaic form that appeared in the old manuals under both of them. I answered with the approved term. Then the grid asked me to describe the process. And I described it, and somewhere in the description I used the archaic form, because in the old manuals the 2 terms appeared in the same paragraph, and 30 years of reading had braided them together in my head until I no longer heard the difference. Flag 3. In the observation ring, Assessor Prell left the elevated ring and came down to the floor. Remedial reclassification required 3 flags. Prell could have stopped the session there. The protocol gave her that option. She did not stop it. I do not know why. Maybe she wanted to see what else the grid would find. Flag 4 came from the atmospheric section. Flag 5 from the geological. By flag 6 I had stopped monitoring the counter in the corner of the interface panel and was simply answering the prompts the way I always answered everything, in the language I had learned, which was the language of walls and manuals and fiber text, and a station that could not afford to throw things away. The Sovereign Curricular Grid had a vocabulary of 84,000 approved terms. The pre-consolidation registers I carried contained words the lexicon had officially deprecated, suppressed, reclassified as regional non-standard, or simply struck from the published edition without replacement. Most of them I had learned before I was 12. None of them had felt dangerous. They were just the words on the walls. At flag 8, Prell sent a query to the grid, requesting source identification. Where was the cadet drawing the flagged vocabulary from? The grid ran the query and returned, source unclassified. The flagged terms matched deprecated registers from at least 4 distinct pre-consolidation linguistic databases, 3 of which the Academy's archive held only partial records of, and 1 of which the archive listed as lost entirely. The grid had been built to flag vocabulary outside the lexicon. It had not been built to encounter a cadet who contained more vocabulary than the archive it was protecting. Prell's ridge crests were running a color I had not seen before. Not amber, not silver, something between them that had no name in Drenith Standard. Flags 9 through 12 came from the advanced sections, policy language, legal phrasing, the specialized vocabulary of governance and arbitration. The Consolidation Committee had standardized all of it 30 years ago and declared the prior forms non-compliant. What the committee had not done was remove them from the walls of every pre-consolidation station in the outer belt, where the insulation panels had been manufactured before the ruling and nobody had sent a work order to replace them. I finished the section, looked at the interface. There were 2 prompts left. The grid gave me the 13th, a technical specification, this one about educational record-keeping, the precise language of academic classification. The approved lexicon had 2 terms for the type of assessment I was currently sitting. I knew them both. I also knew the 8 terms the Consolidation Committee had replaced them with, and the 4 regional variants those terms had evolved from, and the original root forms that appeared in the educational archives the committee had officially closed. I answered with the root form. Flag 13. Prell had stopped moving. She was standing at the edge of my booth's opaque wall, not touching it. Chromatophore ridges firing in a pattern I could not interpret, because Keth Sorvani body language was outside the approved lexicon's cultural annotation section. The grid gave me the 14th prompt, a closing statement. The cadet was to respond with the standard affirmation that the session had been conducted in full compliance with Drenith Standard, a formality, the final procedural close before the grid returned its result. I looked at the phrase, I said it, in Drenith Standard. And then I said it again in the pre-consolidation form, because on my station, the old form was the one people said when they meant it, and the new one was the one you wrote on forms, and I had spent 22 years knowing the difference. Flag 14. The grid ran its result. The session timer reached 0. The booths opened. 21 cadets stepped out into the assessment chamber and looked at the central result display, which showed a status field for each cadet and a compliance summary for the session. 19 of them had passed without flags. 1 had 2 flags. My field showed 14, which was a number the display had not been formatted to render. It had room for a single digit and was showing a truncated character that did not resolve into anything legible. They were not looking at the display. They were looking at me. I picked up my intake bag from the booth's floor and slung it over one shoulder. Prell was standing at the room's central console, ridge crest still running that unnamed color, filing something into the grid's administrative record. She had not filed a remedial reclassification. She had filed a notation. I walked toward the chamber exit. Stopped. What language were the original compliance protocols written in? I asked her. Prell looked up from the console. Her ridge crests went still. Before the committee standardized the documentation, I said. The protocols themselves. What register? She did not answer immediately. In the silence, I could hear the grid's cooling system, a low, continuous sound that the station's engineers had never bothered to insulate against, because it had always been there, and nobody thought to question the things that had always been there. Pre-consolidation administrative standard, she said finally. The committee translated them. I know, I said. I read the original. I left her with that. The cohort was still in the chamber when I walked out, and none of them were looking at the result display anymore. The grid filed 14 violations that session. The Academy's archive held incomplete records of 3 of the registers I had triggered, and no records at all of the 4th. Prell's notation recommended a supplemental archival review. The notation sat open for 3 months before anyone acted on it. When they did, they came to me.